Hello, and you're back here with D-Vlog in conversation with, and I am here with Chris Naughton of Winterfylleth. Winterfylleth are bringing us their new album, The Imperious Horizon, and it lands on Candlelight on 13th of September. Chris, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So it's must be great to be back after 4 years with this brand new album. What's the vibe in the Winterfylleth camp like at the moment?
It's pretty positive, I think. Like you say, it's been a good few years since our last record. I guess some of it not obviously being our own fault, but it kind of all the sort of COVID and everything sort of knocked us and I'm sure lots of other musicians off their stride a bit. So it's taken us a few years to kind of to properly tour the last album and kind of give it the service that it needed, I guess, before we kind of undertook writing a new one. So usually we've had somewhat of a album every 2 years or so kind of work rate in the band, and I think that's normally good enough, like tour it for a year or 18 months and then do another one. So obviously the COVID lockdowns and all that sort of stuff kind of meant that we were sort of delayed doing that this time, and it was strange really, because we were probably the better part of 2 years, I think, before we even toured the last album, Reckoning Dawn. So
Right.
it just felt like kind of we wanted that to get out there and us to sort of have a chance to play that. And also, like, there then seemed to be this huge wave of everybody's kind of COVID lockdown albums kind of
Oh
swamping.
yeah.
I'm kind of glad that's all died down now, and that there's a bit more chance for people to sort of get into the albums when they come out, and not just be overloaded with 70 releases every week.
Absolutely. Well, your music, to my ears, has always had a very English tone to it, musically, and certainly has been described as majestic by many journalists, myself included. And I've even thought that some of the music, if it was played by a string quartet, would be classed as neoclassical. Are these classical leanings an intentional part of your sound?
I don't know if they are or not, to be honest. I, I certainly don't think we enter any album writing process with any kind of agenda to be anything, or to be any specific way. I have this phrase that I sort of trot out in when we're writing albums, just sort of saying, you can only write what comes out. And I
Mm.
think sometimes you go into a song with maybe a bit of an idea in mind. There's been certain like longer songs on some of our albums in the past, and even on this one, where we thought, right, we want to do more of I guess, a sort of doomier influence track, or a longer, more expansive track that's got a slower pace, and that we want to kind of layer up and build, across quite a long and kind of sweeping time frame, I guess. But then other times, you're just kind of bouncing ideas off each other, and we're good friends in the band, and there's some great players in our band now. Now that we've got Mark, who plays keyboards, writing songs now. We've got Russell, who joined in between the last album and this one on lead guitar, who's also in other bands. He writes stuff as well, and myself and Nick, the bass player. We've had kind of four guys writing for us this time. So I think in some ways, there's maybe kind of, I wouldn't say there's like specifically classical elements in it, but Mark, our keys player, does a lot of great stuff with the vocal arrangements. He's worked in the past with choirs and with big kind of like choral arrangements and things like that. So his music theory and his knowledge in that sense is great, and he's obviously classically trained. So if there's any influence, it's potentially from kind of what he's doing. But no, I don't think there is, in a sense. I think it just sounds like a Winterfylleth album, but progressed, and trying to bring new ideas in, and trying to kind of keep organically building on what we've done in the past, and keep bringing new elements to it, and keeping the spirit of who we are. So yeah, I suppose the short answer is no, I don't know if there is, but I'm glad it sort of rings some of those bells for you, as it might do for other people.
It definitely does, and it's also always given me sort of like mental images of grand vistas and dramatic countryside and stuff like that. And black metal in turn does that for me. It's always been a great vehicle for that sort of thing. Have you ever thought of it in those terms, or is that kind of synesthesia kind of like a happy accident?
No, I think that does formulate part of what we're doing. Where we live, where we're from, some of the original ideas of the band were very much based on history, but also on like nature and the environment and landscape and things like that. If you're, depending on how familiar or not you are with the back catalogue of the band, all the album covers are of
Yeah.
sort of vast, grand scenes of nature with sort of no modern anything in them. And I guess they're in some ways a kind of a metaphor perhaps for a need to return to kind of purity in nature, or that
Mm,
we should stop messing up the world with our endeavors and our
mm.
industry like that. But also they're just sort of timeless, and I like the idea of that they sort of represent a moment in time, I guess, but one that's also timeless across the ages. So there's always been this concept in the band about a link to nature, and I think that when you do expansive atmospheric music that's kind of layered and emotional, and it sort of raises the goosebumps on your arms at various points, I think you can't help but almost link that to like a vast landscape. There's a great track from one of our previous albums, The Dark Hereafter, which is called Green Cathedral. I don't know if you're familiar with it or
Yeah,
not,
I
but
am. Yeah.
the whole premise of that track is that you don't need the kind of cathedrals of man to find spirituality. You don't need religion or doctrine or
Mm.
the rules of the Bible or something. You can go and stand on top of a mountain and feel the wind in your face and look out across a vast landscape and across a I don't know a huge lake or a tarn or something like that, and the goosebumps will get raised by the energy of the world kind of passing by you, and so you take your spirituality and spiritual uplift, I guess, from the Green Cathedral rather than the cathedrals of man, if you like. And so I think in some ways we've always tried to capture a little bit of that, I don't know, environmental or certainly kind of natural spirituality in the music and the atmosphere. And I think that they just conjure up those images, particularly as we sort of use some of that in the album aesthetics as well. I don't think you can help but have those two things linked together. And I think they mesh nicely. And people love the kind of autumnal vibe of some albums and the kind of wintry vibe of others, and that kind of change,
Mm.
the different colors of nature that we've kind of put on the album covers, golden dawns, or kind of like, as in like a golden kind of sunlight dawn hitting the kind of mountain, or the kind of the orange autumnal colors of the acoustic record, or the kind of bluer, frostier colors of the sort of the Imperious Horizon that we've kind of gone for this time. So there's always that kind of stark color scheme that sort of runs through it all as well, that tries to kind of paint a mental picture and a connection with it as well.
That's awesome. That echoes actually quite. I interviewed Aaron from Wolves in the Throne Room this year, and he said similar things about the connection of the music to the nature, and I found it fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And it seems to be. I've interviewed quite a lot of black metal artists this year, and one thing that remains a constant throughout, because there's many myriad forms of black metal, but is the one thing that seems to be constant is its usefulness as a vehicle for storytelling in particular. And I understand on this album, thematically, it's actually quite modern as opposed to retrospective.
I mean, sort of. In some ways, I think so. I mean, the macro concept of it, the overall kind of theme of the album, if you will, the Imperious Horizon, I guess in short, is sort of a kind of sneering and arrogant agenda that sort of sits just over the horizon, that's always kind of scheming against humanity, and that you're not quite sure how it's going to manifest, but it's always there, kind of plotting on lots of different angles, and it's coming at you in lots of different ways. And I guess it speaks to a kind of duplicity and arrogance and sort of psychopathy that exists at the top of our structures of power in society, and our governments, and our kind of big corporations, or whatever it is, to oftentimes deplete the resources of mankind to kind of to keep people poor and in servitude, and all the things that I think we all kind of feel at points about the world, if you were to really sort of stop and take a look at it objectively. And so the point of the album is a kind of like misty veiled horizon that is sort of hiding this agenda, I guess.
I love that.
Yeah, and so in terms of what you're saying about it being more modern, I think the concept is kind of modern, although some of the lyrics are still reference things like old pastoral poetry and old kind of works of literature that we've sort of weaved into the songs to have a modern meaning. But I've always had this idea of sort of using old literature in parts of the songs to kind of link back to how things have always been a struggle throughout humanity, but you can kind of link them to a modern context. So like the singles we released, for example, Dishonor Enthroned is about, I guess, duplicitous leaders kind of taking advantage of people, and I suppose the dishonor of being on the throne, if you like. A lot of the time, their campaign slogans or their their promises when they kind of take the throne. They're supposed to be kind of shepherds for the flock, if you like, in the sort of song, but ultimately they end up being the kind of foxes amongst the sheep that are trying to sort of turn the world on its head or keep people down. All the sort of things that I think that we all feel in humanity. And you've got to look at this week or this
Yeah.
last few weeks in the country. The civil unrest that there is between lots of different groups, and that to me is just one angle in all this. It's like one faction of people against another, and some kind of tinderbox that set that off. But then there's also like your religion versus my religion, your identity versus mine, your beliefs versus my beliefs, your political slant versus mine, and all this sort of stuff. And I just think on all these different levels, all the time, from loads of angles, financial, social, housing, gas, electric, whatever it is that's kind of pushing on people. It's not just one thing, it's all these things all the time. And I think that there's always, to a greater or lesser extent, there's always some kind of agenda behind that, I feel. And without being too much of a conspiracist about it, you've only got to look at best, in like say COVID or something, our government spending billions of public money to their cronies and stuff. And like at its worst, there's kind of, well, all sorts of things going on, like secret wars, murdering people overseas.
Absolutely.
All sorts of kind of duplicitous and awful things going on in government. So in a sense, the album's got modern concepts in it like that, but I framed a lot of them using old poems or old written text about kind of struggle or war or whatever it might be, to kind of make that a bit more stylish than just sort of being quite blunt about what's going on in the world. And I think that really, I think that flowery language and that sort of style within which I try to write those songs really benefits the idea that you're trying to create around this sort of evocative style of music, rather than if it's like like a punk album or something, it's always just like absolutely direct, like fuck the government, fuck you, whatever it might be. Whereas in this, it needs to be a bit more grandiose and have a bit more style and elegance about it, I think.
Absolutely, and corruption's a timeless concept, so there will be plenty of like stuff from the past that is relatable now.
Well, you've seen those memes online about like the dictator whose statue is kind of on a rotating platform, and like one dies and then there's a bit of a nice era and then another one comes along, and it's just this constant procession of power struggle in society, I guess. And I think it's always been that way, but I sort of referenced a lot to people when I was speaking about this album that the world feels quite dangerous at the moment and it feels like we're on the verge of something. And I guess what could sit behind that horizon is potentially war or civil unrest or both. And you only have to look at the kind of dog whistles that the government are sort of implying. National service, why would you want that unless you're trying to kind of conscript people for war? Like all the stuff that's happening in Ukraine, that's not going to take much to end up with World War III and all this sort of stuff. And I don't know, maybe that's too far along the line of things, but it certainly has felt to me, as someone who doesn't really have a political standpoint necessarily, but likes to look across what's going on and sort of try and make my mind up about it. And it feels like that's the way the world is headed, and it worries me. It worries us as a band. We've got young children. You don't know what kind of world you're walking into, and it's oftentimes beyond your control. So it's for artists like us to try and frame that in our own way, and I guess bring that to people through the music, I suppose.
Absolutely. I've never agreed with people who've said that politics has no place in music. I think historically speaking, politics has every place in music. And people have always sung songs about discontent. So
I don't think partisan politics has a great role in music.
no.
I think on all sides of the spectrum, there's varying levels of kind of distrust and corruption with our political process. I think the idea of politics being a vessel to serve the interests of the people rather than the people who have been elected, I think is the real crux of all this. And that a government should be a benevolent entity that's looking after its people, or that is trying to at least sort of steer the ship in the right direction. But oftentimes it feels like a vehicle for people with their own agendas to kind of further them and make themselves richer, rather than doing anything of genuine use to the world.
Absolutely. Well, to swing it back round to the album, this is your first album featuring Russell Dobson as a songwriting member. What does Russell bring to the table in Winterfylleth now? Because this album does seem to be a lot more. It seems to be breaking ground, getting a bit broader. Is that part of it?
I think that's fair. It's an interesting one with Russell, actually. I think the album kind of came along at the right time for us all. You know, if we'd have started writing with him straight away, I think it would have been a different outcome. Maybe you are familiar, if you know, obviously you seem to be connected with black metal, so you'll probably know that Russell was in, you know, Necronautical, is still in Necronautical, has his own project that he writes a lot of material for. And if you compare and contrast Winterfylleth and Necronautical, for example, you know, they're much more kind of hyperblast, kind of 300 BPM, really technical, like note heavy, kind of riff heavy songs that require a different pace and a different style of guitar playing than I have particularly. So when Russell came into the band, it was quite interesting for us, our styles to kind of collide with one another, if you like, you know. And he's obviously spent a few years in the band touring the last album before we started writing this one. And so I think that was a good thing because it's helped him to play how I play, in the sense of like he knows the kind of chords I have. I have quite a sweeping and sort of smooth way of playing, you know, not a lot of noise, kind of quite slick, if it's not too weird to call yourself that. But like, I don't mean that in like I'm amazing or something. I just mean that like I have quite a smooth way of doing it.
Yeah.
Whereas he is much more kind of like hyper fast, technical, like right on the beat rather than kind of swinging around it and stuff like this. And their riffs are like swapping between strings, like single note picking and all that sort of stuff. So he's got this kind of fast, aggressive kind of more in the, I don't know, like Dimmu or Marduk kind of end of things in terms of his playing. And mine's much more like sweeping and evocative, I guess. And so when those things combine, I think he at first struggled to kind of do some of the things that we're doing until he'd learned how we play, and vice versa. If he'd have brought some of his ideas from that world into Winterfylleth, I don't know if they'd have worked a lot. So the fact that we got to play, I don't know, hundreds of shows or whatever, or certainly rehearsals and shows, and you know, like time sat together over the years before we made this record, I think it was great because he was then bringing ideas to this record. The second or third riff, I think, on the latest single, Upon This Shore, is a riff that Russell wrote, and it's like probably the most Winterfylleth riff on the album. But he was almost nervous about bringing it because he was like, "Is this too Winterfylleth?" And I was like, "Well, at least we are that band, you know, so we can sound like us in our songs." So yeah, he really, it was really great. But then also, I think what was good about him is that he doesn't always think the same way as say myself and Nick, who've written a lot of the albums over the years. You know, I'll come up with a riff or two, and then Nick will be like, "Oh, my head goes here. I've got this idea." And we're like, "Oh, that's cool," or whatever. And then like Russell will be like, "Wow, I never have thought of that. Like my head goes here." And sometimes you find yourself in this kind of rich position of having several forks in the road that you could take a song down. And I think it was really good. And the songs on the album, one in particular that was, I guess, more Nick and Russ than any of the other songs, which is a song called The Insurrection, which is the last album, the last song on the sort of standard version of the album. And yeah, that was just a real collaboration between those two who have, you know, had very different ideas about that track than I would have done. And I almost kind of sat back in a way on that one because it felt like they kind of had it. And so yeah, having Russ in the band has been a great thing. It's a nice foil to our usual way of doing things, but also if it kind of veers too far, then I'm always a bit like, no, this is not really Winterfylleth or whatever. So it's been good for us to sort of push each other's boundaries a bit, but find something that's great in the middle of that, I think.
Awesome. And once again, you've worked with Chris Fielding at False Studios in Wales. Now, every time I hear about this studio, it sounds like a magical place. I have images of beautiful Welsh countryside in my mind. Probably from the music it's produced, because I've never seen photos of it. But is there something magical about this studio that makes you go back there?
I mean, I have to say, like, it used to be a bit of a dump. Like the band house where you stayed was kind of very basic. It used to be owned when we first started going there in sort of circa 2008 or 9, maybe, when we first went there to record. When we were doing our Mercy Sphere album was the first time we properly recorded there. And the guy that used to own it was this guy, Dave Anderson, who was in legendary bands like Amon Duel, and I think he was in Hawkwind for a while, and he was in the Groundhogs and bands like that. And he used to have a label that put out loads of classic stuff like Phonograph Generator and Osric Tentacles and all that sort of cool stuff back in the day. Like, he was exactly what you would expect him to be, like a kind of a sort of 70s dude that had loads of tie-dye stuff and smoked loads of weed and just was like in his house drinking cups of tea at like 5 a.m. and all this stuff, forgetting to have gone to bed and all this, you know. He was one of those characters. And Fall was kind of the studio itself is brilliant. The sort of the recording space and the gear and stuff is awesome. But the house was the band house was very, very basic, like a shower over a bath and all this sort of stuff.
Right,
And,
gotcha.
it
Yeah.
being so far in the wilderness that it's quite hard to warm up the water and all this sort of stuff, so it was pretty basic back then. And then a guy called Mike took it over and like revamped it, and so now the band house is lovely and like got great facilities and stuff. But there was a charm to it, kind of in both eras, really. But the main part about it really was that Chris was there. That's where he was based out of, and the isolation of the place is one of the main features, I think, about why it's so great. If you to kind of put a pin almost like in the middle of green Wales, it's like there, and even to get to the next nearest little village, which is called Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr, it's like 15 minutes drive.
Cool.
And so you can't just be like, oh no, we've run out of beer, oh no, we've run out of whatever, bread to make sandwiches or whatever it might be, because you've got to literally go ages away, like at least a kind of 40-minute round trip to go get something. And if you're going to go to the supermarket, it's like an hour. Right. So I really like the idea of kind of everyone going away from there. The phone signal's not that great, so you kind of just have to be present. And I think it's a really good environment to do that. And obviously it helps that Chris is there. They've got loads of cool kind of 70s and 80s retro gear in there, analog desk, like all the old kind of like a organ with a Leslie and loads of old cabs.
It sounds amazing.
So it's really cool. And like there's a real sort of rustic charm to the place, and it's in this old converted barn with kind of a mezzanine recording suite, and then all the live performance room is downstairs, and at the end there's a drum booth which used to have this cool picture of Stonehenge on the wall that David
mate
Stone or something. It's a really brilliant place. Some amazing albums have come out of there. So I think part of it is the isolation and the kind of, you are going to a place to record and that is what your job is, and you can kind of turn off the rest of the world. But then some of it is just the sort of the heritage, the provenance of who's been there. Some like classic primordial albums are recorded there, for example, like To the Nameless Dead and Redemption at the Puritan's Hand, and then like some, I think like a few Napalm records like Code is Red, and maybe like Smear Campaign, maybe some of those albums were kind of recorded, or Order of the Leech, maybe one of those, so some of that sort of stuff was recorded there. And there's just some really like crazy history of stuff that's gone on there. And
sounds amazing.
And obviously Chris is the man behind the dials as well, which is I guess the root of the question. But so we would kind of follow him wherever he is, because I think he gets what we're doing and kind of helps us sort of figure that out in the first place. So it just happens that there's a really great wilderness place in this deep Welsh valley that's kind of cut off from the world.
So to answer my question, it is magical.
As long as you bring a jumper, at least like in the early days, as long as you kind of like wrap up warm. But it's brilliant.
So you just mentioned Primordial. On this album, you do have a guest vocal from AA or Alan from Primordial, as I always have a trouble with his surname.
Averill. He pronounces
his real surname. Yeah, no, that's fine.
All right, Nemthianga.
That's the one. Yeah, I'll let you say it. Anyway, look, I'm a long-standing fan of his vocals, so this must have been quite an exciting collaboration. After I understand that you've been friends for quite some time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess what predates all of this is that Winterfylleth toured with Primordial on several occasions. We've gone over to play some of these kind of Redemption festivals that they were doing, over the years, in Dublin, the Academy and various other venues. We've done some touring in the UK with them a few times, and we've gone over and hung out with Alan when we've just been playing shows in Ireland or those guys. So like we got to know him like pretty well over the years, and obviously in communication. In fact, speaking to him earlier, and so like when we were kind of in that limbo period after our last album had come out, we were sort of maybe it was like after that first Bloodstock that had happened, maybe like 2021 or something like that. Maybe almost like a year after like first lockdowns and stuff, where people were kind of finally being allowed to be in venues in any great number. And so we did a tour of the sort of UK tour of the Reckoning Dawn album, and we were struggling to get a support band, because we were supposed to do it with that band Mork from Norway, but then they couldn't get they weren't permitted to leave the country or something because of like the COVID regulations or whatever it was. And then there was a few other options and they fell through. Similarly, I think we're looking at like doing with Alder and Uada and Primordial. And again, it was all just kind of, not Primordial, with Panopticon, sorry, all those kind of bands that are friends of ours. it just didn't work. So we then sort of said to Alan, look, do you want to kind of come and do this tour with us? And so he brought his other band, Dread Sovereign, if you're aware
Oh
of them,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
over to do the tour. And so obviously then we spent 7 or 8 days together all in the van and stuff, and like really, I guess, became obviously closer friends when you're in such
Oh
close
yeah.
proximity to people, and you get a better feel of everyone. And so when we were writing the song, which is called In Silent Grace on the album, we sort of sat in my recording suite, I guess, if you want to call it that, in my house, coming up with the ideas. And we you just sort of, if you make music, maybe you'll know this, you just sort of start singing a melody, or you can hear a melody kind of alongside something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think myself or Nick maybe kind of sung it in a sort of like Alan style of, like, say, the Coffin Ships, or like Rome Burns or something like that, one of those more like epic songs. And we're just like, yeah, we should totally just ask Alan to sing on this track, because it feels like it would really benefit from that quite grandiose and high register but powerful vocal that he's got, and that quite unique style and delivery that he has as well, that sort of really lends itself, that kind of graveliness to making a sung metal track seem a bit more kind of metal, rather than it sort of being, I don't know, lighter, I guess.
Sure.
So yeah, so he came over, and we booked it around like a nice weekend. I think it was the weekend that Sepultura Cavalera thing was sort of playing in
Nice.
Manchester, doing the revisiting their kind of first couple of records, Morbid Visions and stuff like that. So we went to that show, and then the next day we had a full day in the guy that mastered our album, this guy called Mark Minot, he recorded Alan's vocals. So we did a full day session, and had him have a go at the vocals, various different ways, and it was quite nice, actually. So we didn't really prep anything in advance, other than obviously him having heard the track and seen the lyrics. But it was kind of a do it on instinct, sing what kind of comes naturally. And so we probably did, I don't know, like 12 or 15 or something kind of takes through what is quite a long song, so it did take a long time. And then we as a group sort of chose the best bits, and he did it, sometimes he did like a verse like quite low, sometimes he sang it in much a high register. And so it was interesting to hear how those things kind of played out against the sonics of the track. And so some moments we chose this really kind of like vast and
like he does so well.
And sometimes we chose the kind of lower register one, or sometimes I sang the more extreme vocal behind him as well, to sort of like widen the sound and stuff. So it was a really cool experience, and something we probably talked about doing for way longer than it's taken us to actually do it. So I'm glad we got there in the end, and I think it'll be a real highlight for a lot of people on that record, and it's certainly one of the more grandiose and epic songs I think we've ever done.
Absolutely, it's fantastic as well. I can't wait for everyone to hear it. You've been at the forefront of certainly UK black metal since 2008 with the Ghost of Heritage, and you definitely, as for me as a consumer, a fan, what have you, seems to certainly change what black metal didn't have to be like, rather than what it had to be like, in that you didn't do the makeup, and you let the music speak for itself. That at the time was quite unique in black metal. These days, it's quite normal for a band to be sort of doing the black metal sound without the makeup and all that sort of stuff. What do you remember from that time? Did you find it? Did you think what you were doing was out of the ordinary, or were you just being yourselves, basically?
It was an odd period of time for us kind of starting a band around then. I think there was a lot of things going on in the background of that. There had been black metal bands from the UK before, Cradle of Filth, Hecate
Of
Throne,
course.
Balsagoth, but and others, smaller ones, Ashes, and I'm trying to think of a few others. Anyway, there was like Forgotten Woods, maybe bands like that were kind of around at that point.
Yeah.
But particularly the ones that made the bigger impact, the kind of Cradles and Hecates and Balsagoths and people like that. Having spoken to some of them, been friends with them over the years, particularly like the Cradle guys, and Paul Ryan, my friend, who I have another band with, who was one of the original Cradle members, he'd always sort of framed it to me like they were never really, like, in his mind at least, a sort of British black metal band or a UK black metal band. They always felt like they were more allied to the sort of Scandinavian scene, and were kind of like a Scandinavian band from the UK, if you like, even though they're obviously British guys and stuff. And I think because that's where the thrust of it was at the time, there was never really an idea of British black metal, other than the fact that Venom came up with the album Black Metal, and that was kind of the blueprint alongside other bands that many people would kind of attribute the name and the sort of initial stylings of the genre to. So it feels weird when when I think back to that period of time, because it was sort of when we started the band about 2006,
Mm.
and we put our first demo out in 2007. So at that stage, we'd already been in other bands. Like I'd been in a band called Atavist, I guess a sort of like death doom band for, well, 5 or 6 releases before that. So I think we were like, certainly myself and Simon a little bit, from a band called the Seventh Cross he was in, we're sort of reasonably well known in the UK underground by certain people. And so it would have felt really weird for me at that stage to kind of just don a spikes and corpse paint look, because I think people knew me from being in Atavist. And so it would have been weird to be like, oh, it's Chris from Atavist now in corpse paint on stage or something. And we'd always had quite an organic, I guess, like just us and you in the audience kind of thing approach to that band, and it being more about the sonics of the really heaviness and all that sort of stuff, and it connecting with people on a sort of physical level rather than an aesthetic one. And so it would have felt weird for us to do that. But also I think that where we were headed with Winterfylleth was not what people would traditionally have assumed black metal is. If you think about the classics of the genre, certainly the early ones, you're looking at, like, I don't know, the Dark Thrones and Mayhems and Burzums and all that sort of Satyricon and all those kind of things that came out in that, you know, early, like late 80s, early 90s kind of period. There was a distance there, you know, like people didn't have the internet, people didn't have anything other than like grainy photos and zines or in the album covers or whatever it might be, and there just was a bit more artistic distance. But also that was those guys' reaction to what was going on at the time. And, you know, given that the sort of roots of the genre are in more like nihilism and kind of cemeteries and evil and Satanism and anti-Christianity and some of those things, and not only that, but, you know, that was kind of a lot of the first of that kind of black and whiteness of it. When we were doing stuff, you know, we were influenced much more by bands like Ulver or Enslaved or kind of, you know, Trudk from the Ukraine or Primordial, or some of the bands who had, or even like bands like Eternus, who had like one foot in traditional black metal, but also this kind of more like organic theme. And even though we've sort of incorporated what people kind of refer to sometimes as folk melody or folkishness, like there's a very big difference for me between like folk metal, which is like Corpiclani, or like one of those bands that's like, it's kind of twee, but sort of like it's fun for people at certain points. But this isn't folk black metal in a sense. It's like it's got folklore in it, and it's got maybe some like folkish melodies, but we were very much veering towards that more kind of organic nature, you know, seeking the mountaintops rather than the graves kind of thing. And so our thrust was, I guess, like atmospheric, evocative, passionate black metal music, but one that was kind of more uplifting rather than lo-fi and kind of search for the melody and the in the mire of it. And so for us not to do corpse paint felt like the right thing to do, because we were trying to have the music and the nature artwork and the imagery and the backdrops and stuff kind of be the thing that you connect with, not us being characters, if you like, or having a persona that you're kind of the band sits behind, you know. So
absolutely.
I think a lot of people at first thought we were just kind of like tourists maybe who'd never understood the genre and like would, you know, didn't get that that's what you're meant to do and stuff like that. But that couldn't be further from the truth, really. We've all been
absolutely
metal for 30-40 years, you know, between us all. So it just felt like at the time people didn't get it, and I think it took people a few albums, and certainly people I've spoken to on other podcasts, like I don't know if you know Cheyenne, who does the Ableist Manifestations podcast. Like he's a friend of ours, but like he was saying he didn't get the band at first until he spoke to me, and then was like, I now understand why you do that, and it feels totally authentic to me, you know.
For me it was more like I got the music first, and then when I saw you live I was like, these feel like more like a band of the people than, you know, someone in corpse paint who's like thrusting inverted crosses at me. It would just seem like these seemed like anyone, like I could make black metal. You know, you don't have to be some sort of guy who lives in a cave. You know, like, you know what I mean?
I mean, there's maybe an element of that. Like, I certainly don't think there's a lot of pretense about us in that sense. I don't. I love all that stuff. I love the fact that belongs to, you know, I love that it belongs to Mayhem and Garl and whoever else that all do that kind of thing, you know. But we did a tour latterly with Garl and Garl's Weird, his band, and it's just really, it was really great to obviously spend time with you know, with Garl for like 2 weeks. Christian,
he's an incredible guy.
He's super interesting as well.
Mm,
But like I just love the fact that like Corpse Paint belongs to people like him, and
mm,
he's such an intense person. Even though he's kind and friendly, he's always very sort of intense and interested, and kind of, he can have fun and be jokey, but I mean he's like an artistic and really kind of
mm.
visceral character. And so when he does it, it feels like
Yeah.
it's for real. And I feel like if I did
Mm.
it or we did it back then, it would have been because that's what you do.
Yeah.
I don't think, because there wasn't a clear vision of like there being any UK black metal bands that were doing anything
Mm.
that under the kind of banner of being from the UK, then it felt like we sort of had not carte blanche, but certainly like some room to
Yeah.
try and kind of forge what that was, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So after 8 albums and 18 years in the game, you've seen a lot of change in the black metal scene, obviously.
Yeah.
Um, a fair amount. What have you found to be the most inspirational, exciting aspects to come out of the scene? And are there any artists in particular you'd like to single out as being particularly inspirational on their take on this, what is now a very broad scene?
It is, yeah. I, 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 I mean, there's loads of bands that have been inspirational to me. Obviously, I sort of mentioned some of them earlier. I think the landscape has changed a little bit. I think certainly from a UK perspective, when we started in 2006, even that being like kind of, I don't know, 10 or 15 years probably after the sort of original bands in that genre kind of came out with their classic records, it still felt like it was a relatively unknown thing in the UK. And it was
Mm,
certainly going through a bit of a lull as well. Like, if I think about Candlelight, the label that we're on,
mm.
they had like obviously all the early Emperor albums and kind of, Psy and um I can't even think that the depth of stuff that's not like Odium, I think was maybe on
Yeah,
that,
there
or
was.
like Mertzgog and bands like that,
Mm,
all that sort of Zyklon, everything like that was like on the label earlier then.
mm,
And it felt like there was a real big lull between like the latter period of the 90s and kind of like 2006 or 7 when we
mm.
started in the UK. And it was like there was some, if you look at their catalog and that of other labels, it was in that weird kind of when new metal was becoming a thing and post
Yeah.
metal and doom metal was kind of a thing. And that's when all that sort of black metal lull was, even though there was some good albums that came out in bits and pieces throughout that time period, like
Mm.
Thorns, for example, and stuff like that,
Yeah, I've never
but
thought of it like that.
but
Yeah.
there was this real lull there. And so when we started, around then, it was quite an interesting time period to sort of be in. And I guess, in some ways it was about kind of finding our own idea, but then also it was a bit of a resurgence in a sense. I think people were maybe bored with that whole like doom metal thing that had kind of been going on, that sludgy thing that had been going on for like 5 or 6, 10 years, whatever it was, that post metal thing had kind of popped. But then what I found interesting about the UK scene's reaction to that, obviously there's ourselves and bands like Wodenstone, who sadly have kind of finished making music
Mm.
now. And I felt like we were kind of down one vein of it, but then there was a kind of like quirkier end, like the Forest of Stars guys, who had this more like
Mm.
weird Victoriana kind of quite pompous sort of sounding thing, which worked for
Mm.
them. And then there was, bands like, I don't know, well, Skaldic Curse and bands like that were around then. Or there was, oh, who else was there around then? Fen, obviously, great band doing
Ben,
like,
yeah.
Seor, but in kind of earlier incarnations, Fallock and
Mm.
Askefal and things like that. So it was an interesting time. And I think what was kind of apparent was that like there was this thread that ran through everybody of wanting to do something in a black metal way from the UK, but then it kind of manifesting in loads of different ways, and it never felt super coherent because there was all these kind of different identities for it. But then I think as bands like ourselves and Fen particularly kind of got abroad and started playing festivals and kind of bringing black metal from the UK abroad, it certainly helped it be much more of a credible thing that you could do. And then all these other bands have kind of sprung up over the years, and now there's like hundreds and hundreds of them.
Mm.
Like Abduction and
Mm.
Sun's Journey Through the Night, and God,
Well,
Infernal Sea, and
Infernal Sea, definitely.
all these kind of bands that have sprung up, and that's just the ones I can think of in like 2 seconds.
Mm.
There's tons of them,
There is.
and so I don't know, like the landscape has changed definitely. I think across the UK it's changed, and I think it's become more acceptable to kind of incorporate bits of black metal in your music. And although not a lot of fans always like it, if it's sort of say like a band like Death Heaven or Ghostbath or something like
Mm.
that, where maybe it's like it feels more like hardcore with bits of black metal. Not everyone always likes that, but then the other side of it is other bands have kind of gone more down that organic route and sort of
Mm.
tried to do something like that. And there's certainly been more of this kind of post or atmospheric black metal was never really a term for it was just black metal. Black metal is
Mm.
atmospheric, but then people started referring to like what we do as atmospheric black metal, when to me it's all atmospheric. But then I know what they mean by it. It means it's kind of
Yeah.
not lo-fi and gritty. It's more produced
Fast.
and outward looking rather than inward looking and stuff. So there's lots to be, I don't know, inspired by. I'm trying to think like back to your question, like what are some of the kind of there's been obviously waves of these things. There's other genres have kind of permeated
Mm.
it, but there's always been this kind of purity through the middle of it, of lots of bands making kind of great sort of visceral classic albums as well.
Mm.
Some of the bands that stick out to me of late, I guess. I'm just trying to think what I've been listening to, but like they're sort of
Even non-black metal, I mean.
I mean, as a band, we like all kinds of stuff, but I think certainly from recent periods, I mean, like bands like Achilles, for example, from the USA, they're like
Mm.
they've got this whole kind of like visceral, almost like verging on sort of dark ambient
Mm.
mixed with like quite angular black metal that I think is really kind of reacting with people, and they're doing really well. You've got the guys from like Maguire that have come through who do quite a classic style of black metal, but that's really kind of catchy despite being quite almost evil in a sense. You've got guys from like bands like Uada who sort of have made USA black metal a bit more popular, because even though that's an enormous country, like there was
Mm.
never really very much that came from there. That there was
Well,
Wolves
yeah.
in the Throne Room a bit, like
Yeah.
Leviathan a bit, but it was always more down that kind of depressive end, Zaster
Yeah. There
and
was
Cremain,
Nacmistium as well. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and that it was all like a much more druggy, dark,
Yeah.
evil, in a rather than like stuff like Wolves in the Throne Room came out. So I guess bands like some of those are some of the ones that sort of stick out as having done something. But then there's great bands from all over, like Miss Therming from Iceland, and there's
Mm.
like Primordial from Ireland, and
Yeah.
Jevel from Norway, who do like great
Oh, they're
stuff
super good.
in a classic way. But then there's like bands like Dodheimsgard who've gone from being absolutely like Chronet Til Kong, for example, which is
Mm.
like necro black metal. And then now if you listen to like Black Medium Current, their most recent album, it's
Mm.
like vast, crazy avant black metal with
It's
almost like
very, it's like,
tiny bits of like circus music in it, and
yeah.
all sorts of stuff. But it's like really amazing. So I don't know. I find inspiration in all of those things, but I don't think there's one I could single out, to be honest. But
Mm.
there's loads of stuff that I love, and I think there's loads of really interesting identities that have kind of come out of that from all over of Europe specifically.
So after 18 years, you're still being inspired, which is great, you know?
I think so, and if I sort of reflect on that tour we did with Gars Weird, for example, some of the guys that are in Gar's band are like incredible musicians. Kevin, who plays the drums, Spectre as his kind of pseudonym is. He like recorded the drums on the latest Immortal album. Like he's obviously done he's done loads of session work with other people. Like he's really, him and Simon, our drummer, and Diogo, who's a drummer from Guerrilla, who were also on that tour. They were
Oh,
like
yeah.
they were watching each other. Like Diogo Mota, like the guy that drums in Guerrilla, like he's an incredible drummer, like
Incredible band.
super technical, fast, brilliant. And I think those guys were then quite interested in how sort of restrained and stylish Simon is and smooth he is, the way that he kind of like moves around stuff and it's not choppy and weird and stuff like that. And so when they were kind of playing and watching each other, there was some nice little quirks from some things that Kevin was doing that Simon's kind of maybe brought into some bits on the album. And I know, vice versa, those guys that took inspiration. And you just can't help it because
Mm.
they people find these other atmospheres that you haven't thought of or that's not naturally within you, and it really kind of gives you a spark to, oh, maybe I'll have a think about how we could take things down a different avenue. And it's definitely good to have your ways of doing things challenged, unless you end up writing the same album every single time.
Absolutely. I mean, I know, especially I was at Fortress Festival this year, and the standard of black metal, I was completely inspired because there was so much going on, from, like you say, Guerrilla to, like, oh, just Wolves in the Throne Room, obviously. There was loads of stuff, but also Ultha, Daylight, like, just so much good stuff. So to round all this off, it's a great time to have Winterfylleth back. When everything's so primed, and I feel a real excitement about black metal at the moment. So yeah, it's good to have you
I'm
back,
glad.
man.
I'm glad. Thanks. Yeah, and it's good to be back. And it sort of feels a bit weird that we have had so long away, because certainly a few years of it almost just feel like a bad dream in a sense. I think if you as you will have done, you lived through it like we did.
Mm.
It feels like it never happened. But then
Yeah.
there was like kind of 2 years there on and off that we were just sort of in limbo, and
Mm,
so it feels weird to have kind of paused the band in a sense,
mm,
and now we're kind of here again. So I'm hopeful. I'm hoping that people still care, and that that they'll connect with this record. And I genuinely, hand on heart, think it's one of our best albums. And I know that artists always say that about their most recent one, but I genuinely think with some new writing influences from Mark and Russ, a few kind of different angles and a few
mm.
different takes on things, that it's one of our more intricate and interesting and atmospheric. There's loads more keyboards this time, for example. There's a few shorter songs, there's some of the longer songs, some slower songs. I think that the atmosphere runs through it all, but there's definitely a pace to it that makes it not just a relentless barrage of snare drum and blast beat. So hopefully that connects with people and they get something from it.
Absolutely, man. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, Chris.
You're welcome. Cheers, George.
Thank you very much for being with us.